Welcome to another episode of the Three Presbyteers. I'm Josh Owen, and I'm accompanied here with one of my presbyters,
Aaron Garrett, associate pastor here at Spruce Creek and managing editor of Ligonier Ministries.
Thanks, Aaron, for that really good introduction.
Was that better?
Yeah. I feel like I know you now.
Good.
Okay. Well, this episode is going to be a report on the 2025 General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in America, which was in Chattanooga, Tennessee.
The 52nd.
The 52nd. Yeah. So it's 1 year older than I am.
Wow. Old.
Yeah.
I mean,
young for a church. So, I guess to get started, we just, say we had a provisional stated clerk, John Bise, who's a very...
before you get into that, can you rate Chattanooga 1 to 10?
I don't want to do that publicly.
Okay. Never mind. Go back to...
Let me just say, it ain't Port Orange.
True. Good food, though, I thought.
I would agree with that.
I had Detroit-style pizza, which is funny. It's in Tennessee. But the pizza was good.
Was it?
What drives me nuts about Florida is we only have New York-style pizza. But I have Detroit-style. Was good.
They have a... I believe Detroit-style is actually what they call it at the Bronx House. And it's really good.
At a New York pizza place.
Well, it's called the Bronx House, but yeah, I think they have a Detroit.
I trust you.
Pan.
You can buy that for me.
Deep dish.
Okay.
Yeah,
we'll try it.
It's delicious.
Okay.
Yeah, next time we go there, we're getting it. Okay, and you can compare it to the one in Chattanooga.
Okay.
So we had a provisional stated clerk. The stated clerk is generally pretty consistent from year to year. We've had a few since the beginning of the PCA. So that kind of tells you there's some longevity usually to that office. But Bryan Chappel retired from that office, and we'll say a word about that here in just a minute. But John Bise served as the provisional stated clerk, and he's a fine parliamentarian, did a very good job of guiding Kevin DeYoung, who was elected as the moderator this year, and we'll have more to say about that as well. But really appreciate John Bise's work there.
Yeah, but Bise seems to be respected by most camps in the PCA. So I think he's a good man to fill that role, at least for this year. Can you explain, Josh, what's the role of the stated clerk in the denomination?
Well, he, along with, I think, the administrative committee, generally speaking, helps to facilitate a lot of the General Assembly's actions throughout the rest of the year, right? So we meet together just for a few days, once a year, and the administrative committee is then carrying out the will of the assembly and facilitating the business between our various committees and commissions. And the stated clerk, I don't really know if I have a job description for him in mind. You might know more about this than I do. But his function largely at the General Assembly is kind of like the chief parliamentarian, to make sure that we're staying on business as it's on our docket, but also making sure that we conduct ourselves properly according to our rules for assembly operation.
And why did Bryan Chappel retire?
So Chappel's retirement was stated as being for the peace of the church. So for those of you who are unaware, in leading up to this year's General Assembly, Chappel committed at the very least, we could say, a great indiscretion. He was in an interview with, I think, someone from the Gospel Coalition.
Yeah, Colin Hansen. Okay.
And in that interview, they got to talking about, divisions in the church and those who divide the church. And Chappel, you can watch the video online, but he reaches over and he grabs a sticky note from off his desk and he holds it up in front of the camera and he says, "Yeah, I'm keeping a list here of scandalizers of the church." And something, I'm not quoting him exactly, okay? But then he proceeds to say, that these men were scandalizers, in other words, they're like dividing the church unnecessarily.
Not just men and women.
There were women on there too. Yeah. And then he proceeded to say, ironically, that all the people that were on this list had either left the faith or left their family or had committed suicide. I think it was the three things that he said. I don't know who on that list has actually done those things, but I know there were several people on that list. One that I know personally, others that I know just tangentially, maybe professionally, that I know, as far as I know, have not done any of those things. In fact, I'm certain that they haven't committed suicide. For most of them, I'm really sure they haven't left their families, and their families are not aware of it anyway. And as far as their apostasy goes, well, as far as I can know that, I think we know it.
And he said that he did not intend for the camera to pick up the names on that list, but somebody had grabbed a screenshot, and it was fairly visible who was on that list. And so this prompted some outrage and people who were upset. And so he gave an initial apology, I think through TGC or maybe through a social media page. His apology, in my opinion, wasn't the best. It kind of shifted some blame to those who grabbed the screenshot rather than confessing the sin outright.
Yeah, it's what we used to call a non-apology apology. It was basically to say, it's like saying, I'm sorry you're overly sensitive and got your feelings hurt by what I said.
Yeah.
Like, that's a non-apology apology, right?
And then to his credit, he then, I think, made private apologies to each of the individuals who were on that list, calling them and making apologies to them, confessing his sin, repenting. But many thought, this is just too much for him to continue in his role. And so
I think he thought so too.
I think he thought so too.
And there were those, of course, that were writing open letters appealing to him not to step down, and other open letters that were appealing to the assembly in general, more or less to not let him step down, not accept his retirement or his resignation or anything, this kind of thing. And then there was others who were arguing, no, it's really, he needs to step down. Right. And so you had that kind of open letter correspondence going back and forth leading up to the General Assembly. But I really think he made the right decision.
Yeah, me too. I was among the camp that thought he should step down, and he did the right thing. And he confessed and apologized. And I think we are quick to forgive brothers who fall in sin, but then repent of that sin.
Yeah.
And so we wish the best for Bryan Chappel and his future ministry, whatever that looks like.
Yeah. One of the things that, a lot of people said when the news of this first revealed, was probably the most disturbing thing was that he was keeping a list of names of people that he considered scandalizers of the church. And, I don't know what he had done already with any of the names on that list. If he had reached out to any of them and tried to start conversations with them, why was he keeping the list? What was the goal of the list? Was there some agenda to maybe block them from, if people called him about a reference, or do you know this guy? Do you know that guy? Oh yeah, he's on my list of scandalizers. I don't know how he's going to use it, but I think for me and many others, probably the application to our lives is to say we ought not to be keeping lists like that of fellow Christians, and especially fellow ministers. That if there are people, we need to follow Matthew 18.
Yeah, if you have a grievance against a brother or sister that warrants writing them down on a sticky note, that's a pretty good indication that you should call or meet with that person. Right.
That's studying the peace and purity of the church that we promised to do. And you're going to have disagreements with people,
sure.
And you're going to have in mind people that you want on a team and people that you would rather not have on that team. I'm not saying that that's wrong, but
also to call them scandalizers.
Yeah, I think it was a little over time.
Yeah. Also, lastly, to his credit, I also think that I heard he issued a last apology at GA to the admin committee, I believe. So he also apologized once more to that committee, and again, I think made the right decision to step down. But therefore, we needed a provisional stated clerk.
Exactly.
And so that's where John Bise has filled that gap.
And then we had our moderator. There are moderators elected each year. We alternate between a teaching elder and a ruling elder. So since 2024 was a ruling elder, this year was teaching elder, and Kevin DeYoung was elected without any contest. No one else was put forward. I think overall, Kevin did a good job. The moderator is not usually expected to be any kind of professional parliamentarian. We've had a couple, and
he was pretty close.
He was good,
yeah.
But you can tell the guys like John Bise, they really know,
and Greco,
that kind of process, and Fred Greco, they can really take you through the business, pretty quickly.
I think Kevin was one notch below Greco.
Yeah.
But very, very impressive, honestly. I would never take that job. Would you?
I wouldn't qualify for it.
But even if I nominated you,
you remember the one year they brought a guy in, and they didn't really look for somebody because he had any qualifications. It was I don't really want to go down the road to why he was put in there, but he clearly wasn't prepared for it.
Oh, I remember. Yeah.
And when the business started to get a little complicated, and you had like motions upon motions building up, he just basically handed the gavel over. To a true parliamentarian and said, would you basically take us through this portion of the business? And
it's hard.
It was it was the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Took a little humility to do it. But it does matter. It helps us get through the business faster when the moderator has some idea of what he's doing. Kevin did a good job.
Yep.
He did come under some criticism for an exchange that he had with TE Timothy Brindle, as some people were questioning Kevin's partiality or impartiality. Brindle was making a speech against the actions of the MNA, that's Mission to North America director, Irwyn Ince, and DeYoung cautioned him when he made a statement that that he believed impugned, or he referred to as intemperate. He didn't really explain why it was intemperate. We can maybe guess as to what DeYoung thought was intemperate about the speech. If you follow anything on social media, Doug Wilson immediately jumped on this as an example of DeYoung being progressive, and or at least having some tendencies or caving into some pressures from progressives. That might be reading too much into that particular exchange. Our presbytery, I don't hear this kind of stuff very much at our presbytery. We seem to kind of loosely follow Robert's Rules of Orders and such like that. Robert's Rules of Order, not orders, in our presbytery. But in the last presbytery I was part of, I was so used to this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I mean, like we were pretty strict in how we followed parliamentary procedure, and oftentimes people were rebuked for intemperate speech. When we hear intemperate speech, we usually think somebody's saying something like really nasty about someone. But in this case, where DeYoung stopped him was when Brindle made a comment about if Irwyn Ince feels uncomfortable worshiping with a person like me because of the color of my skin, then ... right? Now, I don't know if Brindle was referring to something that Irwyn Ince had said. I don't know. That's unclear to me. But I think that's the point at which DeYoung interrupted him and said, please remember to use temperate speech. He didn't. Now, if you looked at the clock, Brindle's time for talking was actually running down. He had like 6 seconds left to talk by the time DeYoung interrupted him. And that ran out. The clock ran out. But if that was not quoting Ince, then it would be speculating about his motives, and we're not allowed to do that. So we do follow our rules of assembly operation, and we follow the book of church order. And I wanted to begin with this, and I forgot to, but since we're on this subject, if I might just read a couple of verses of scripture. 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 33 says, in the context of worship, he says, God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints. And then as he discusses a little more how that applied, particularly in the case of worship in the church of Corinth, he says down, let all things be done decently and in order. So, the context there is worship. And he's saying because of the character of God, the character of the worship of God should be like this, right? But I think we can extend that principle because God is a God not of confusion, but of peace. And he is a God of order. Therefore, worship should be orderly. Therefore, my walk and my conduct of my life should be orderly. Therefore, my family should be orderly. My church should be orderly. And the way that we do business should be orderly and not create confusion. And so it's important, that we do uphold, I think, standards of how we conduct ourselves in the course of business. Good, what we call decorum, right? And I think that's what DeYoung was attempting to do. I think there was people maybe who were listening to Brindle's speech that they may have even been saying something from the floor away from a mic that we couldn't hear, that maybe DeYoung could hear, where people were growing restless and feeling like, okay, this is intemperate, and he was responding to them. I don't really know where it arose from.
And the whole thing was very awkward because the whole discussion was centered around whether to reappoint Irwyn Ince as the director of M&A.
Yeah, exactly. And so let's talk about that for a minute.
Okay.
He was reelected with a vote of 62%. Now, if you compare that to, I think, generally, usually the reelection of these or the reappointment of these directors is never challenged.
Yeah.
And if it is, it's a small minority of people that would challenge the reappointment of someone. So the 62% really sends a message, I think, that
because there's been a few things over the last year or so that M&A has done, or at least under M&A's watch, that are concerning to some of us. Yeah. So maybe we can talk about a few of those.
Yeah, I think we should, to keep the congregation abreast of what's going on in our world. If they're not staying on top of it, I don't blame you if you're not. Okay. But one of the things that M&A, where they aired this year, was in their statement about immigration guidance. They had posted and then later removed it after some criticism, a web page with links to information advising illegal aliens on how to evade detention by ICE and how churches and Christians might be able to, help people evade the authorities. Ince then, after some public criticism, issued a statement of repentance and of apology, and calling on people to, Romans 13, right? Obey the civil authorities and honor the laws of our land and so forth. So that was one area of concern.
Another had to do with what's known as affinity group worship, where there are worship services that are exclusively for one particular ethnicity. And Irwyn Ince came under fire because he supported and I think even attended a worship service, I think on the West Coast, that was exclusively for Black people. And I'm against, like, we're all against that. We're all against any form of racism, anti-racism that would segregate Christians in worship based on race.
Yeah.
And so there were some alarms that went off when it became clear that the director of M&A is supporting these affinity groups. And I think that is what Timothy Brindle's concern was, whether he raised it properly under the rules of our Robert's Rules of Order. And Brindle actually goes on to Matthew Everhard's YouTube channel to discuss this. If our listeners are interested in hearing what Brindle has to say on that, he didn't mean any ill will toward Ince or toward DeYoung, nor do I think DeYoung meant any ill will toward Brindle. But Brindle's concerns had to do with the director of M&A, who is really in charge of domestic church planting in our denomination,
Right.
having supported and perhaps supporting these affinity groups that place race as a defining quality to separate worshipers.
Yeah. It's funny. I don't want to get too far away from our subject, so I'll try to be brief with this. But this is one of the things that when I was a Southern Baptist pastor, that I really struggled with our denomination. We had like local associations that would be similar to a presbytery, but because Southern Baptist churches are, 10 times as many as PCA churches, we'd have in North Carolina, the association I was in had over 100 churches, and it only covered about one county. Okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, compared to the PCA, that like we one county in the PCA, you might have one church. Okay. So our presbyteries are like much more large regional than that. Central Florida, right? Not just like one little county. But in this Baptist association, they had a church planting kind of assessment come in. So they had this sociological group come in to lead us in a study of our area, our county. And as I participated in this. So I went around and drove around, looked at the area, and we all came back and reported where would be potential places for church plants. Okay. So I come back and I identify places, where there's either no Baptist church or there's a Baptist church that's struggling and maybe we need to work on revitalization, right? That's what I'm thinking, right? But no, that's not what we do. We come back and it's like over here we need a middle class church, and over here we need a upper middle class church, and over here we need a black church, and here we need a Hispanic church, and over here, and now I mean, we're not talking about just like language barriers.
Yeah.
We're talking about ethnicity,
right?
So all this, and I'm thinking to myself, wow, this is kind of weird. Like,
redneck church over here,
yeah,
cowboy church, yeah.
Well, yeah, believe me, we had the cowboy churches, we had biker churches, it was a little bit of everything. Those were so they were following, I think, this affinity model.
Yeah.
Now the way they were following it would have probably not been a kind of with any statements of exclusivity. If you're not a biker, don't show up here. If you're not a cowboy, don't show up here. They wouldn't have said that. They're just more or less like, let's craft our ministry, let's craft our worship style to appeal to this group of people. And if others show up, great, but this is who we're trying to target, right? That's what they would say. If I'm not mistaken, I think one of the things I'd read may not have been accurate. You can fact check this, but that the service that Ince attended made a statement of this service is only for black people.
Correct.
And like, there's going to be another service later that everybody can come to, but this one is just for black people.
I believe that's correct. And the idea was that the black people need a safe space for themselves where they can let their hair down, I think is what Ince said. And so the idea there is that each ethnicity needs their own space.
Yeah.
That's why Brindle said, if the director feels this way. Now, he might not have been quoting Ince directly and faithfully, but that's the idea that he was trying to put out there. This is concerning. And we would share those concerns.
I'm still looking for a worship service where I can let my hair down.
Me too. I haven't found one yet.
Yeah.
I was hoping to find one here at Spruce Creek, but you guys have not been very accommodating for that.
No. I never let my hair down. I'm very guarded. So yeah, then another question that came up with regard to M&A was about the budget.
Yeah.
The concern.
They had about a $2 million deficit, right, over the last year.
That's more information than I had. Yeah, I appreciate that. I couldn't remember the exact number, but
it was close to $2 million.
There was a big deficit. Yeah, I think you're right. I want to say it was. Now, they're kind of the way they alleviated concerns was to say, oh, we have so much money in reserves that if nobody gave a dime this year, we could continue to operate for X number of months and years. Okay, fine. But the question that was being raised was that Irwyn Ince was receiving a 10% raise. Let that sink in. Okay, 10% raise. While we are suffering a deficit that, the question was, why are we spending so much money on administrative costs and not on church planting and disaster relief and other things that M&A oversees that are the ministries that our people are giving to. I mean, we all know how it is. You want as little of your offering to go to administration and as much as you can have go toward ministry, right? Actual on the field ministry. So, there was an attempt to reduce the amount of his raise. I think maybe even to deduct from what his current salary was.
Because he is pretty well paid. And that's public information. What this highlighted for me more than anything, Josh, is a conviction that I've held for a long time, and that is that local churches and presbyteries should be the ones leading church planting efforts. While M&A can be a resource, M&A should not be the ones leading those church planting efforts.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yep, daughter church plant. So I guess we move on. We've talked about some of the big leadership discussions that we had with Bryan Chappel and the provisional clerk, and then Kevin's leadership as moderator, and then the M&A director. Those are some big leadership matters.
Let's get into the overtures next. And, and the overtures are those changes that are proposed changes to our Constitution, which is made up of the Westminster Standards, the Book of Church Order, which is comprised of really 3 sections, but only 2 of those sections are constitutional. And an overture goes from either a presbytery or an individual up to the overtures committee, which is made up of members of TEs and REs. And then if it passes, goes to the General Assembly. If it passes General Assembly, it goes back down to each presbytery to vote on, which needs 2/3 votes. And then it goes back up to General Assembly the next year to be ratified. Yeah, that's kind of the process of an overture.
Yeah, and some overtures, of course, can also be to ask the church or move that the church collectively speak to a certain issue, or to erect a study committee to study an issue. But yes, many of them are addressing constitutional questions and maybe wanting to revise the Constitution in certain places. So one overture that came up was, which I was actually in support of. It's what we practice, and I think that it's wise for all churches to practice this, and that was to restrict who can distribute the elements of the Lord's Supper. To restrict that to ordained officers. That was the overture.
So elders and deacons.
That was to elders. So the idea would be that it would be elders first, but in the absence of enough elders, then deacons, as ordained officers of the church, could also step in and exercise the responsibility. Now, there's not a question here. Because our Book of Church Order is already very clear, and this is constitutionally binding, that a teaching elder officiates the table. That wasn't the question. The question is, when it goes from the table to be distributed to the congregation, who should be carrying it, from the table to the congregation, as our church practices it, and as I think this overture's goal was. Our ruling elders do that, and occasionally a deacon will step in when we don't have enough ruling elders to help do that distribution. So,
because we see the distribution as an extension of the administration.
Right. And it requires a burden of responsibility. One, somewhat be in the know. Now, nobody can do this infallible, and our ruling elders can't do this infallibly, but to be somewhat in the know as to who should and should not be partaking of the Lord's Supper, and then to have the authority and the boldness to refuse the supper to someone that shouldn't be having it.
And a 10-year-old can't do that.
Right. If you're giving it to, and I would say, is that a responsibility that we want to give anyone who is not under ordained, orders, right? Every member of the church should have a care for the well-being of the church. And of course, the taking the Lord's Supper is part of the, the care for the church, the welfare of the church. And I think every member should have a proper concern for that. And I believe many of our members would. But is it a responsibility we want to put on them? If we hear a noise, in my house at night, my wife is concerned for the security of our household as well as I am. Okay. But do I want to give her the responsibility to go and check out the noise.
Totally.
Are you Ashley? Probably could take somebody out of
That's
it
right.
pretty
Yeah.
quick, couldn't she?
But why didn't this overture pass? What were the arguments against it?
Well,
That the Bible doesn't speak to it.
That's the primary argument, saying that it actually says more than what the scriptures say.
And we would argue it is by good and necessary consequence,
right?
Because it is an
right.
extension of the administration.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah, there's not some command that says now when the pastor,
Yeah.
leave, whatever, you know what I'm saying, that this is how it's to be done. No, it's
Yeah.
not spelled out like that. But we're saying, look, by good and necessary consequence, we're talking about something that requires a level of responsibility that we think is best. It's wisest to put this in the hands of the elder. But as it is, it's going to continue to be left up to the elders of each church.
And so presumably you could go to a PCA church in the area and they might have women or children distributing,
right?
Whether they are the ones bringing it to you or you're coming up to them, they could be the ones distributing
right.
the Lord's Supper. And that would be okay within our denominational standards.
According to some.
Yep.
Yeah. Although I would still interpret our Book of Church Order, our directory for worship, in a way that would require that not be done.
And we'll get to that, because one of the two study committees that was voted on this year was to study the directory of worship.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. So, but that overture failed. So as it is, things continue as they have been doing. Next, there was an overture to appoint a committee to revise the directory for worship to something that we could agree on as constitutionally binding. Well, that overture passed, but the question immediately arose, given the worship service that we had that night, what is that going to actually look like? Because the worship service we had that night was very much not by the directory for worship that we have now. Yeah, that was an understatement, right? So the question that I had for two gentlemen that were in front of me, I won't say what church they were from, but they were from a very large, much larger church than ours. In their minds, it wasn't large, but how it always is when you're at a big church, you don't realize you're at a big church. But anyway, these gentlemen were talking about how that their church, they have a traditional worship service, and then later they have a contemporary worship service. And it seemed to me that they were much more excited about their contemporary worship service. And so I asked them, I said, so since we've just appointed a committee to revise the directory for worship so that we can have a constitutionally binding document to guide our worship as PCA churches, how are we going to do that when we have a church like yours that worships like we just worshiped in here, and a church like mine that follows the directory for worship, and that we currently have, right? And one of the guys was a ruling elder, and he immediately said, well, how about we just leave that kind of stuff to Rome? Leave that to the Roman Catholics and let them, issue from above how everybody is to worship. And we don't need that. We don't need that. Basically every church can decide for itself how it wants to worship. That was the ruling elder. And then the teaching elder, he was an older gentleman, but he proceeded to, tell me about all of his education and experience, and why it was kind of interesting. He says that the contemporary music, the contemporary worship model arose out of Puritan principles of simple worship. And I wanted to call Andy Webb right then and there and just say, Andy, did you know that in 50 years, your church is going to be worshiping just like, Mana Church in Fayetteville, the contemporary church in Fayetteville, because
that's the way the Puritans worship.
Because this is what happened. The Puritans said, hey, let's keep worship simple. And the next thing you know, boom, we have laser lights and fog machines and rock bands. That was interesting.
But can you explain though, Josh? It's confusing, I think, to some people that we have a part of our Constitution that is not binding.
Yeah. So the Directory for Worship has a couple of chapters and sections that are constitutionally binding. The section on marriage is constitutionally binding now. That's as of a couple of years ago. The chapter on the Lord's Supper and baptism, those are constitutionally binding. So how are the sacraments to be administered? That includes things like, how is a person brought to the Lord's table? That's part of that section of the Constitution of the Directory for Worship that is constitutionally binding. But all the other stuff is not.
It's like pious advice.
It's pious advice, exactly. And so all the stuff about preaching, all the stuff about the order, the elements of worship and the order of service, those are all more or less advice.
Which I think is unique when you compare it to other NAPARC denominations.
Right.
Most of their directories for worship are binding.
Right.
The whole thing.
If we could put it this way, other Bible-believing Presbyterian churches in America, all of them have a directory for worship that is constitutionally binding.
Mm-hmm. That's what I was going to say. I think we are the only NAPARC church that doesn't have a constitutionally binding directory of worship.
Right.
I think that's right. And the directory is pretty, I would say it's pretty flexible. I mean, it's not like the Anglican prayer book. We have to follow these forms of worship. But what it would do is give us more uniformity from one PCA church to another.
And I think that for many of those who really wanted this revision to occur so that we could have a binding, constitutionally binding director for worship, many of them, they want it to be something like what's already there, right? They don't want a drastic revision. When Terry Johnson stands up at the mic and argues in favor of this, you know what he has in mind. If you go online and look at Independent Presbyterian Church and look at the way they worship, what he has in mind is that our worship would be more consistently in the historic Presbyterian model. I'm skeptical. I guess I'm just skeptical that our big tent denomination is going to be able to produce a directory for worship that is going to be agreed upon by 2/3 of the presbytery, as well as 2 general assemblies, because that's what it's got to do. It's got to pass 2 general assemblies and 2/3 of the presbytery in order to become constitutional. I'm just not seeing that.
So is it because this is an ad interim committee that they can actually recommend a revision? Because usually committees just offer, again, pious advice. But this committee, will they actually have the authority to submit a revision? Gabe, do you know?
I think the committee is tasked with doing a revision.
Okay.
And then it will be up to the assembly
to vote on it,
to decide if they want to adopt that. But
so depending on how drastic the revision is, it could make some people happy and some people angry.
Yeah.
If they come back with hardly any revisions and say, hey, let's make this whole directory constitutional, well, the contemporary worship churches are not going to like that. Right.
Unless it's so broad.
Yeah.
Right. They're going to have to revise it to be so broad that it says really nothing of substance. Because here's what I will give credit to, right? The churches that are using contemporary worship services. I mean, to the few that I've been to, in my travels when I'm on vacation and stuff that are doing this, to their credit, most of the time the preaching is solid, and so you find a lot of agreement on what preaching ought to look like in general, say not right down to the details, but in general, I think you're going to find the PCAs in good agreement on what preaching ought to look like. But when it comes to decorum, I don't think you're going to find any agreement on that.
Yeah, I agree. There was a second study committee, right? There were 2 study committees that were approved this GA, which I don't think there's been a study committee approved for 5 or 6 years.
Yeah.
So this has been,
people got really tired of them.
There was some fatigue.
It costs a lot of money.
It does. Yeah.
And then what are they?
Yeah.
Right. They're
Presbyterian parties.
Yeah. You always wind up with a majority report and a minority report, right? And They're good information, but they're really just a rehashing of material that's already out there.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how I feel about this one that you're getting ready to bring up.
Yeah, me too. There was an overture to appoint a study committee on Christian nationalism. I think an overture. I think there were 2 or 3 different overtures. Oh yeah, Star Spangled Banner.
God bless America.
I think there were 2 or 3 overtures that were made to the overtures committee to appoint a study committee that would help pastors in our denomination understand what is meant by Christian nationalism, because there are many millennials, my generation, maybe not your generation, because you're a boomer, right? Just kidding. That's an inside joke.
Yeah.
He's Gen X, right? You're Gen X.
Yeah. Whatever that means.
Yeah.
I always thought that was a little weird.
There is a resurgence of interest in what's been coined Christian nationalism, and so the General Assembly passed this overture to appoint a study committee to study Christian nationalism. And there was debate, quite a bit of debate on this issue, right?
Well, surprisingly, there was very little debate.
Okay.
There literally were 2 guys to speak against having this study committee, and there was a host of people standing at the mics that were saying, "I'm for it. I'm for it. I'm for it. I'm for it."
For different
literally,
reasons.
Kevin DeYoung's going around saying, "Microphone 2, you for it. We've already had a speech for it. What are you? I'm for it. Microphone 4, for it. Microphone 6, for it." Is there anybody at any microphone that wants to speak against this overture?
Why didn't you stand up?
Because Aldo Leon did it for me.
Oh, Aldo did it?
No, I
Okay.
should have gotten
Yeah.
up. I actually should have gotten up and finished Aldo's speech because he ran out of time.
What did Aldo say?
Aldo took his time to basically read from the original Westminster Confession of Faith regarding the civil magistrate, and then to read from the American Revision to make the point that the American Revision does not basically say that the church should not seek to have a public witness to the civil magistrate, okay, the civil government, and so forth. And I don't know where he was going to go with the rest, with the rest of his speech, but I love Aldo. He always speaks my mind for me, so I don't even ever really feel like I need to. I'm not one of these people who wants to hear the same thing from the microphone over and over and over again. I'm like, okay, we've heard it once, let's move on. But there were a lot of people who spoke in favor of it, and I'm not as concerned that we're having a study committee. I'm kind of like, studying things is good.
Right.
Okay. Several years ago, I decided to start studying Christian political philosophy. And I've studied stuff from the early church period through the Middle Ages into, Christendom, and then to, the kind of Reformation, post-Reformation. You have Christendom kind of like being redefined and somewhat falling apart with the Enlightenment. And, so I'm studying something is great. I think studying this will be really helpful for a lot of people.
If we appoint the right people for the committee. I think that's one of the concerns as well, right?
But yeah, what troubled me was what I was hearing as arguments for doing this study committee. Mel Duncan, for example, refers to Christian nationalism as a menace. Well, at this point, do we need a study committee? We've already decided that this is a menacing thing. Others are talking about things like it's a problem, it's troubling churches. I have young men coming to my church who, they love America and they love Jesus. I don't know what to do with that. I'm sorry, nobody actually said that or
like that,
or said it like that. But
that's concerning. My other concern is that the men who are appointed to serve on the study committee, I hope we get a variety of men, and that those men consult other experts. Like I think the study committee should consult with, the Stephen Wolfs of the world. I think there should be men like George Grant on the study committee who've studied the history of these things. That there should be people who are more covenanters on the study committee, so that we can get an actually helpful report from the study committee, rather than coming back and just saying Christian nationalism bad,
right,
condemn it.
Yeah, it's funny because I've talked to so many people who say bad things about Stephen Wolf and his book on Christian nationalism that within 5 minutes of the conversation, you realize they've not read the book. they've just heard other people talk about it, and they just keep repeating the same misinformation about it. And I won't name those who are guilty of this, but I mean, anyway. And they don't know how to make a distinction between somebody who's literally at the beginning of the book saying, I'm not writing a book of theology, I'm writing a book on political philosophy. And then their main critique of it is, well, he doesn't cite scripture a lot. Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. You don't know what genre this is. So anyway, that overture passed. So we're going to have a study committee on Christian nationalism. Don't know who's going to be put on it yet.
I don't think we know that yet. No.
So wait and see.
So two study committees were formed.
Yeah. I don't know if there's anything more to say on that subject right now.
No, I don't think so. But I think it relates to, because there are certain forms of Christian nationalism that we might say have some weird aspects to it. You know, maybe some kinism, maybe some racial supremacy. But again, it's kind of a red herring.
I'm saying that to me is a different issue.
Yeah, that's right.
Like you're talking about a political philosophy versus a I don't know, a view of, well, I guess you're asking a question when you talk about nationalism, you know, how do you define a nation? And I guess there are some people who, you know, would define it more narrowly than others. So we adopted this statement right after basically appointing this study committee. We adopted this statement, and I'll just read it here. Condemning racial supremacy is basically the way it's summarized. That the 52nd General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in America does hereby join with the Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church 221st General Synod. That tells you how young our church is.
They're older.
Yeah. And with the Reformed Presbyterian Church in North America, 193rd Synod.
They're older.
Yeah. In condemning without distinction any theological or political teaching which posits a superiority of race or ethnic identity born of immutable human characteristics, and does call to repentance any who would promote or associate themselves with such teaching, either by commission or omission. Now, I'm always a little leery of being told that I could be brought up on charges for omission. In other words, if I don't say just the right thing that you want to hear on this subject matter, you're going to bring me up on charges. This sounds a little bit like it's not enough for you not to be racist. You must be anti-racist. Right? And so if I don't see you out here at this rally, we're going to have a problem. You know, particularly don't care for that part of it.
Yeah.
There's I don't know. I don't find it to be the clearest statement. Some people might think, well, it's abundantly clear. I don't find it to be the clearest statement when we're talking about issues of philosophy. Because we're talking about issues of philosophy when it comes to this. I think you need to be a little more precise as to what you're aiming at. What are we saying is excluded, and what are we going to allow, and so forth. So I don't know. I feel like it was kind of hastily adopted because it's one of these things like people were standing up at the mic and saying, but you know, this is an issue now. It might not be an issue next year. So we've got to speak to it now. And it's just kind of like, well, you know,
and the ARP and the RPCNA did it. And
right.
So maybe there was some, hey, let's jump on the bandwagon as well.
Yeah,
possibly. I'm not trying to impugn motives, but you know, these are two other denominations in NAPARC that we love and respect, and and they passed it, and so then we passed it. I do think that there's some things to be improved upon here. Like I'm not even sure what immutable human characteristics means. But at the end of the day, and I'm not interested in things of, you know, racial superiority, ethnic superiority. I don't really give much thought to those things. So I'm kind of indifferent to this statement.
Yeah, I know.
Honestly.
Well, I mean, let's face it. You know, what we all struggle with the most is personal superiority.
That's right. Yeah. And I don't feel superior because I'm white. Because you're white too. I feel superior to you because of other reasons.
Because you are.
That was a joke.
Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah.
I hear you.
So that statement passed, correct? So now PCA, ARP, and the RP have adopted this statement.
Right. I mean, like, you know, I think everybody knows here, you and Gabe have superior radio voices, right? You see? and I have a superior radio face. I mean, let's face it.
That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
Absolutely true. That's why you're sitting in the middle. I'm on the side.
All right. So a few overtures passed that have to pass now through 2/3 of the presbytery and then come back to the 2026 General Assembly in order for them to become constitutional. Okay. So let's just walk through a couple of those. One of those, overture number 8, that officers, not just teaching elders, but the deacons and ruling elders must state their differences with the standards. Now, that's something we already do here at Spruce Creek, so that really won't affect us if that goes into effect, because
What are the standards? Westminster standards.
the Westminster standards, yeah, so they have to, if they have a difference with the Westminster Confession of Faith or the larger or shorter catechism, that they would have to state that, explain their rationale for why they have that difference, and then the session would have to decide whether or not they're going to allow that difference, as an exception, and any counsel that they would have regarding, how that officer would then need to proceed, with that exception, right? That's how teaching elders are already handled at the presbytery level. Overture 32, those who are suspended from the table may be excommunicated without a full trial. Anything about that? You want to say anything about that?
No, I actually would like to hear your thoughts on that. I wasn't there for that debate.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't developed a lot of thoughts about it. I mean, generally speaking, if somebody's going to be excommunicated, I would think you would have a full trial. You would want to have a prosecutor appointed, as well as a counsel for the individual that's on trial, or and then so that can walk them through the process and how they can be exercise all their rights as they go through the process before a judgment of excommunication is actually issued. So I don't know that I really want to see that occur. I mean, if there was already such a process that led to the suspension, if there was a judicial process, which I guess that's what they're saying, is there's a judicial process, and out of that judicial process, this person has been suspended from the Lord's table. But now that the person has been suspended, they're being contumacious. They're not repenting. They're not cooperating with the court, and therefore we're going to up that the sentence, the penalty, to excommunication rather than just suspension. I don't know. I could be persuaded of it.
I'm not a fan, because the purpose of church discipline is also with the hope of restoring the sinner. So we would suspend someone from the table, hoping that would shake them up enough, or cause them to be grieved by that act, and that would ultimately lead to restoration. So if you can simply at the next session meeting excommunicate that person without even reaching out to them again, engaging them any further, or hearing from them at all, I don't agree with it. I mean, I just think it would be inappropriate and potentially harmful. I mean, we've had to suspend people from the elements before. In one case, it ultimately led to excommunication, but in another case, it didn't. So I'm not a fan of being able to I mean, this is the worst thing you can do to somebody. And then we're going to do that without further trial.
Right.
I don't think it's appropriate.
Yeah. And we already have a provision for a case where someone refuses to cooperate with the court, that they can be tried in absentia. Right. So because of that, there's really no reason not to, follow this process. So I don't know. I think, Gabe is right. As you can see, I'm kind of on the fly here with some of this.
Yeah.
Overture 33 then mandates specific things to not text children, but test children to become communing members. So when a covenant child who's baptized in infancy is coming to the Lord's table, it's the session who will examine them and bring them to the Lord's table. And this proposal was that the child would have to pass a certain test of questioning relating to the understanding of gospel, understanding of the Lord's Supper, and the 5 questions that
the vows, right?
Yeah, the 5 vows for membership. Now we
already do that.
We already do this. I think, I'm personally, I'm not in favor of this overture, though. I really just think you don't need to dictate to the sessions what's their process for bringing the children to the Lord's table. They know they're to be looking for a credible profession of faith. Yeah. But I think because once you put some specifics down, you got to do this, and that. Well, what is the understanding of the Lord's Supper? Right. I mean, in some sense, that's something I hope we're all growing in. Mm-hmm. So what are we saying? That the child knows that the bread represents the body of Christ, and that the wine represents the blood of Christ? Do we want them to be able to explain what transubstantiation is, and that we don't believe it?
And sacramental union.
Right. So I love the opportunity when we're examining children. I love the opportunity to talk to them about these things. Yeah. But how far do we examine their knowledge and understanding of them? I think that should be left up to the session to determine.
Yeah, if the elders of the church are competent to one day judge the angels, then elders of the church should be competent to ask questions in a way that gets at that credible profession of faith.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I don't know if there's any other overtures that you want to comment on.
None that come to mind.
I was just going to make a couple of reports here about my own attendance.
Yeah.
I attended the GPTS events. There were 2 of them this year. It was really nice. Tuesday night, we had a nice social.
Who's GPTS?
Greenville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. Oh. We support them, and with our missions giving, and we're grateful for the great training that they're doing for, especially providing good pastors for not only our denomination, but for others in NAPARC. Mm-hmm. And some international students. We had a luncheon on Wednesday, and for the seminary, and one of the
did you get the water bottle?
Sorry,
did you get the water bottle? Free water bottle?
Are you asking me that because
No.
My answer?
No.
I as I was exiting, they were going to hand me the gift, the water bottle gift, and the thing was like that tall. And you know how lazy I am.
Oh, you said no to it.
So I said,
you turned it down.
I did, and it really offended the young man.
Did it?
I think that he thought I was secretly a Covenant Seminary plant that was in there to spy on them to see what they were saying bad about Covenant Seminary. Because he just looked me up and down like, well, who do you think you are to come to our event and then not accept our gift? And I looked at him and I just said, hey man, I'm going to buy it online. Okay. I'm just too lazy to carry it around this assembly with me the rest of the day, which is true. I don't carry anything.
Have you bought it yet?
Not yet.
When you do, let me know, because I'll buy one. Because I wasn't there. I did get a free T-shirt from Greenville. Their T-shirt, but as soon
with Columbia Seminary on
it? Yeah.
I got 2 of those, but I left them in Kevin's car. So Kevin, if you're listening, I hope you preserved my 2 T-shirts. And that
Kevin who?
Gardner.
Kevin Gardner has your T-shirts?
Yes.
Oh, he already gave them away. I guarantee it.
He probably did.
My son took mine as soon as I brought it home. That night, I see him wearing it for his pajamas. I'm like, go ahead, son.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. It fits him well, huh?
It fits him well.
The other thing I attended was the American Reformer had a panel discussion on Wednesday night. Now, here's an interesting point. Okay, they did have a booth with the PCA exhibit hall. They had an exhibit, and they got kicked off the exhibit hall.
Did they really?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And do you know why they got kicked out of the exhibit hall?
Because they were handing out cigars.
No, because they're identified as Christian nationalists.
Oh, okay. I thought we were studying that.
I go again. Why are we creating a study committee for something apparently so many have already made up their minds on? It was an excellent panel. I think more from the PCA would have benefited from hearing this panel. I don't even know that I would characterize the panel as being Christian nationalist. It was certainly concerned about our nation and our culture, and our witness to our nation and how we are bearing witness within our culture. And they had panelists that were experts in the area of higher education.
Was Aaron Wren on that panel?
Aaron Wren was there. So Aaron would be kind of more one of your say cultural analysts, right? And then we had a seminary professor,
Ben Dunson. Right?
Yeah. And we had guys who specialized in like politics, yeah. So you were getting multiple perspectives on saying kind of like, where are we at as a nation? Where are we at as a culture? And then kind of the questions of what are our challenges and how can we be meeting those challenges as Christians? I'm not even sure that a lot of the panel was about how can we as a church meet these challenges. A lot of it was just more or less how can we as faithful Christians meet some of these challenges in our culture, in our nation, and so forth. So anyway, I thought it was a very edifying discussion.
Is that panel online for us to watch?
I have looked for it and not been able to find it. So I
Okay.
don't think they recorded it. If they did, they haven't released it yet that I found. It would be useful if they did, though. Well, anything more from?
Well, there's a connection there because Ben Dunson is the New Testament professor at Greenville.
Yes.
And I think Ben Dunson started American Reformer. Is that right?
He might have been there on the ground floor.
Okay.
I feel like there were 2 or 3 guys there at the panel who took credit for starting it. Aaron Wren, I think, took credit for starting it.
Maybe indirectly.
And so I don't know. All these guys probably were having the same idea and trying to envision what they wanted to do.
But overall, it's hard to evaluate a General Assembly. It's hard to say it was good or bad.
Yeah.
You always win some, you always lose some. Did you catch that there? Win some? Just for you, Gabe. But I think overall, it was an instructive General Assembly, an encouraging General Assembly. Some votes that went our way, some votes that probably didn't go our way. But probably the best part is always the meals and fellowship that you get to share with other brothers in the denomination, and the free gear, which apparently you didn't get much of because you were too lazy to carry it around.
I was tasked with getting T-shirts for John Hughes and Tom Hilgers, and I succeeded.
Then you succeeded.
I succeeded. Yes,
Which one did Tom want?
Covenant College. He's an alumni.
Oh, same with John. John wanted Covenant College.
Yeah.
Okay.
Alumnus. He's an alumnus. John's not an alumnus.
So did you go up to the Covenant College booth and say, "I need 2 shirts for 2 deacons"?
Yeah, I mean,
And it worked?
I actually didn't get too specific. I just they have so many shirts there. Honestly, I think they're like, take them.
They do. Yeah. There are many other podcasts that have done a General Assembly recap that's probably better than what we just gave. So if we have some listeners who are interested in that, Ryan Bise had a highlight reel of the most important speeches, which I think Timothy Brindle's speech is on there as well. For the Westminster Standards podcast, if you want to look at that, or Matthew Everhard, I mentioned him earlier, has a YouTube channel where he does a recap of the General Assembly. And then lastly, the Polity Matters guys, the Polity Matters podcast have done a recap. So if you're interested in hearing more or better commentary on GA, feel free to consult one of those 3 podcasts.
Yeah. And go ahead and mark down the time at which Aaron began to share that with you, and just tell others to go straight to that time signature and go listen to those other podcasts, because I'm sure they're a lot more informed than I am on these things.
But hopefully that was a helpful discussion as we go to General Assembly as officers of the church. We recognize that we go on behalf of the members of our church. And so it's important for us then to report back some of the highlights so that our congregation feels like they understand what's going on at the broader level of our denomination. And so I do hope it's a helpful recap for our people. Since they didn't go, we went on their behalf. It's good to keep them abreast of what's going on.
Yeah, well, I think that pretty much wraps up another episode. Thank you for joining us, and we hope that you found it informative. And until next time,
Walk with the
7 miles on a dusty road, 2 men travel with a heavy load. Friendly stranger comes and joins the walk, fills their hearts when he starts to talk, fills a time with words of truth. They don't yet know who he is. Walk with the Lord. Walk with the Lord. Troubled woman sits by the well, sinful past as he can tell. Sits and listens to this Jewish man, already knows and he shares the plan. Living water that'll quench her thirst, she doesn't yet know who he is. Walk with the Lord. Walk with the Lord. Young and proud, a Pharisee meets the Lord and he couldn't see. Truth is shown and changed his views. Now he knows and he shares the news. Chief of sinners spreads the word. He knows now who he is. Walk with the Lord. Walk with the Lord. Walk with the Lord. Walk with the Lord. Living word and the bread of life puts to rest all your worldly strife. He's chosen you before it all. Walk with him and you'll never fall. His yoke is easy and his burden's light. All you need to do is walk. Walk with the Lord. Walk with the Lord. Gotta walk with the Lord. Walk with the Lord.